Okay, the title of my talk was supposed to be 2 models for improving spatial thinking, but it has changed to 3 models. Now, and the reason it's changed is I've been interacting with these 3 Australians here, not just because there's 3 of them, but because they have greatly influenced my thinking about this. Kevin Larkin, Tom Lowry, Robin Lowry, from Australia, and Tom will be joining me for some of the talk where I talk about his research. I'd rather have him here than me try to fake it. So there's many people to thank, and since oftentimes we run out doing that, I'm going to do it in advance. Steve McGee of the Learning Partnership, and Catherine James,
hey, Katie.
Graduate, Jose Sotelo, who's a graduate student at Northwestern, Bob Colvert, who's actually the author of the Geospatial Semester, which I'll be talking about, and is in Virginia, and Carolyn Jordan, who was, until recently, the head of CPS, Career Technical Education, and many others. Okay, so there's many, sometimes, I can't think of the word, many tales about the relation between spatial thinking and scientific discovery. Perhaps the most famous one is Kerkele's insight into the structure of the benzene molecule. Now, I only recently understood the relationship between the fact that the snake is a circle and the benzene is a 6-sided molecule, but it was the insight into the loop, the ring structure, which he allegedly got from his dream, where he dreamed of a snake while he was on a train and woke up and had this epiphany. And likewise, relatively more recently, when Watson and Crick finally discovered the structure of the DNA molecule. There were many people working on this problem. It was a big problem, but it was described as a radically new spatial insight. In fact, they wrote, "We wish to bring forward a radically new structure for the DNA molecule." Not quite, the chemist in the room would know. They said something much more sophisticated than that. But the point of this is, when we think about scientific discovery, we often think of visual spatial insights. And in fact, we now know that STEM and spatial intelligence are related. And this has been demonstrated in a variety of different fields, including all those here. There has been research in all of these fields that shows how valuable spatial thinking is to the practice of these sciences. And one of the reasons is that spatial distributions allow us to think about patterns and multiple relations, and that's what science really is about. Now, some of my best friends use language every day. In fact, I use language every day. But language, it's a good thing. But it does have its limitations. And one of the most severe limitations is the communication and the subsequent mental representation of relations. If I say to you, where are we in relationship to the John Hancock Tower, that's not hard. But if I ask you to do that for 6 or 7 different buildings, you're almost certainly going to turn to some sort of visual spatial representation to communicate the information. Language can only do it serially. This can do it in parallel. And so the two, language and visual spatial representation, go hand in hand. So everybody says you have to have a definition, so here's mine. Spatial cognition is thinking about locations and the relations amongst those locations. Easy enough. Now, the importance, it's kind of weird with Mike sitting here, like the phrase preaching to the choir, carrying coals to Newcastle, all those things that are coming up with. Maybe some of you aren't convinced, so I'll try. So you don't need to reread about this. Okay. These anecdotes are cute, that spatial thinking is important, but there have been now several large-scale studies that show that spatial ability predicts achievement and attainment in STEM above and beyond other typical correlates like math and verbal ability. So what this is, this slide tries to put everything we know about spatial thinking going into various fields. So when we measured you in middle school, eventually where did you end up? And those with higher spatial skills were more likely to end up in the STEM fields. Sorry, education. But it doesn't mean education was low on everything. It's just people who are high spatial are relatively underrepresented in education. That's all it means. It makes no causal inference. Okay. Also, this is all from John Way's work, spatial ability also predicts creativity. So they operationalize creativity in this way in schools of engineering as patents versus articles. So everybody has to write articles. Some engineers also discover or invent new things, and those may be patented. And so they compare productivity in terms of academic output, the standard paper, versus creative output. And they found that spatial ability was a unique predictor of the creative portion. So it's really important. And we can talk about why. That's partly what I'm going to be talking about, is why does this relationship exist, and what can we do about it? And those two are obviously related. What we do about it depends on why we think it exists. So at least it should. So I will, as I said originally to Allison, I will be considering two ways of enhancing spatial thinking relative to STEM, but it will now be three. Okay. So the first I'm going to call generalized training. I like it. It's very calming. Is that an Enya? Oh, no, loco. It does sound like Enya. What's it?
It does sound like Enya. How many of us know about Enya?
The younger ones are like, what are these old people talking about? Enya's not that old. Okay. So generalized training can be thought of sort of like the mind as muscle metaphor. That if we teach these basic skills like mental rotation, that you then have increased your capacity, and then you can just apply it across different contexts, across different domains. All of you who work with Mike know that this is his favorite theory. Not. Let's talk about what's good and bad about this approach. So the second approach that I'll be talking about is called spatially enriched STEM practices, actually. And the third is called spatializing the curriculum. I'm going to talk about at least two, possibly three of these. So generalized spatial training is like you practice things like mental rotation or perspective taking, and there have been literally hundreds of studies of this, and I meta-analyzed them. So I've read thousands of studies that claim to have done this, and I've included over 200 that actually did it. Some of them are quite boring, where you come into a lab and you keep mentally rotating till you get reasonably close to asymptote where you can improve no more. Mm-hmm. Others are much more interesting and exciting, involving like playing some video games. They could also be life experience things, including learning to design clothing is one of those things where they assessed pre-test, post-test of people who were going into clothing design, things that were thought to be highly demanding. The logic of this is that first we will increase spatial training, and that in turn, we hope, will increase STEM outcomes. For the first part, I would say there's little doubt that this is true. We can do this. Spatial thinking is malleable. Whether it lasts is one question, but whether it transfers is the really, really hard question right now. Whether it could lead to improved STEM outcomes. So first, let me give you the evidence that spatial thinking is malleable. We did a meta-analysis of over 200 studies of spatial training, and we came up with an overall effect size of 0.47, which could be classified as moderate. But I want you to make sure you understand that these are compared to the most conservative and often active control groups. So one of the things that turned out to be the trick of this is that the control groups often improved as well. Some of that is just like being tested, helps you learn to test. Some of it might actually be that you're getting some insight into spatial thinking simply by taking multiple tests of spatial thinking. So wherever we draw the line. But so 0.47 is quite conservative. And also, if you were going to say, we need an intervention program, I wouldn't choose the average. Because of this meta-analysis, I can identify some that work much higher than 0.47. With those two caveats, what would 0.47 do? Well, it would have the effect of shifting the whole population, if you believe it's true, almost half a standard deviation. And that could make a real difference. So say, for example, that the average mechanical engineer has spatial ability about 1.5 standard deviations above the population as a whole. If we shift everybody in that population by almost half a standard deviation, we now have twice as many people who have that level. So if it did work, it could really be great, and even at moderate amounts could make an enormous difference. We also found that in some studies, training lasts. Now, to be fair, this is showing whether there was an immediate test or a delayed test, and anybody knows anything about psychology, because I've never seen one where delay was equal to immediate. That doesn't make any sense. It's a selection bias in that the studies that trained for delay tended to use more effective interventions. But at least it is a existence proof that it can survive some delay. Most of these are the average introductory psychology experiment, which is at most 2 hours and usually much less than that. 1 hour is pretty common. But, and in some cases, there was, it worked for at least, enough to be educationally relevant. So if I can improve your ability for 1 hour and you leave and it's gone, that's not going to be very effective. But if we get into months and years, then it might be worth doing. So the question is here, okay, does it transfer? Can generalized training improve STEM learning achievement and persistence? And most of you will recognize that we're running right into the problem of FAR transfer. And FAR transfer, as there's been, for 100 years now, there's been demonstrations that FAR transfer doesn't exist. People don't seem to get it, they keep trying. There's another demonstration. So you can find, I just found this morning, 6 or 7 recently, within the last 2 years, published meta-analyses, theoretical overviews, all making the same point, that things like short-term memory training, working memory training, music training, executive function, there's like 2 or 3 other ones, where the hope was if we build up kids' minds, then they'll be resistant wherever they are. If you go to the gym and you lift weights, you're not limited to only lifting on the weight machine. If you have to remove the refrigerator, then you should also, it transfers. Weightlifting transfers, we hope, to some extent. But spatial training might not for these reasons. So let's review this classic work on the lack of FAR transfer. It starts with Edward Thorndike, who was the first educational psychologist and spent his career at Teachers College at Columbia University. And he rejected this idea of formal discipline. So the formal discipline was like, we all should study Latin because it strengthens the mind, and then we'll find ourselves able to transfer to whatever it might be. So even if you're going into business or agriculture, you still need to study Latin because you'll be a better whatever you are, because you've strengthened your mind. He argued against this, and in fact said, the mind is a machine for making particular reactions to particular situations. Improvement in any single mental function rarely brings about equal improvement in any other function, no matter how similar. This is actually getting not just FAR transfer, but even near transfer. That's a different story. But the point I'm trying to make is FAR transfer is pretty far out. And these studies are assuming it can happen. Any disturbance whatsoever in the concrete particulars reasoned about will interfere somewhat with the reasoning, making it less correct or slower or both. And these are some examples from Thorndike's papers where these are mathematical equations. They express the same mathematical relations, but changes in the superficial form made it impossible. There was no benefit for having worked or practiced in this form when you got to this form. So this is a question about x plus y, and this is a question about b1 plus b2, not a question about adding 2 algebraic representations. You see what I'm saying? In people's mind. When I teach intro psych, and I use mathematics for 20 minutes of one class, and they're all saying, why is there mathematics in psychology? And it says, but you study this in 8th grade. It's just algebra. And many will get it, but it's like, whoa, it doesn't belong here. It has a superficial difference. Why, I didn't know there would be math in psychology. Well, okay. And then it came up again in the 1980s with the work of Jick and Holyoke, where they showed that people don't transfer unless they are specifically reminded of the relevance of the two problems. This is the famous general problem. Does everybody know this? Okay, so this is actually quite prescient. This is like foreseeing the cyberknife, where you concentrate lots of radiation at one particular point in the body so that in accumulation it can destroy the tumor, but no single ray is harmful enough to the surrounding tissue. It's only in accumulation. So that's a way you can destroy a tumor without doing so much damage to the surrounding tissue. The analogy is a general wants to attack a fort, and there's only a couple of bridges, and if he or she sends her troops over the bridges, they'll collapse over the main. So they spread it out and distribute it more, build new bridges or something like that. I'm just realizing I don't fully understand the problem, but I've lectured about this at least 20 times. It's good, it keeps you young, you know. You can always be surprised at your own idiocy. It'll come up. It'll come up and bite you. So most of those do not spontaneously transfer unless prompted. But prompts, depending, okay. And like I said, now everybody is, this is like Lacafar for 3.0. So people have done, like, working memory training is so cool. I mean, and you definitely can improve your working memory, but whether it will help kids do better in school it's pretty hard to prove. And I say all of this because this is the bar that generalized spatial training must face. That if it actually does improve STEM performance, then it is going against what is perhaps one of the most consistent findings in the history of psychology. So it could happen, but I think the theoretical push is on the wrong side, you know. So if someone says, if we train people up, then they'll do well in everything, it sounds very tempting, but it's never been true. So nevertheless, they persist. There are some good examples of that. There are some successes. I'm not going to deny that. There probably are many more failures. You know, I think there's I'm being much more critical than I thought I would be. There's a file drawer problem, almost certainly. And we're talking about trying to do a meta-analysis of these training studies, and getting that file drawer problem is going to be particularly severe, meaning that studies that don't find effect aren't published, and they're deeply repressed in people's memory, and it's hard to get them out to show. And well, Mix and Chang have demonstrated that training mental rotation led to improvement, specifically in these kinds of problems. But what's lacking for me is a theory of why those kinds of problems per se. And they say it's something about envisioning things in different sides, but I think they're wonderful researchers, I really do, but I find the explanation sort of post hoc, and I don't really understand the cognitive mechanism. Tom's going to help here soon. And then Sorby and colleagues, Cheryl Sorby, who is an engineer, has had some success. Originally, she had an entire program for students who have been admitted to an engineering school, but are identified first by self-selection and now by pretesting as at risk for not doing well in engineering because of their spatial skills. And the goal is a very good one, to try to improve people. So she has now it's a semester-long course where they do all kinds of things. As I said, originally it was self-selected. They would send an ad out and say, you know, we find that some people have trouble. If this sounds like you should take this class. You all know, and they got effect size 2.0, but that's very self-selected. So they got more sophisticated about it, and they used a regression discontinuity design. People familiar with this? It's really quite cool. It's like pretty close to causal. I mean, you know, people debate. Economists use this a lot because you're looking for something where everything is the same except for the intervention. And what the intervention here is that the class became required, whereas before it was optional. Then you have the terrible self-selection problem. But now we say, if you score below some criterion on our spatial ability test, you must take the class. And so that's a regression discontinuity. And so this is the projected line of the relation between mental rotation preschool and calculus grade. And it went up considerably after the intervention. So this is evidence, despite my somewhat tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic discussion of it. There was some evidence of it working. The trouble is that it's not consistent. We don't have a theory of when and why. And given that the baseline is against all of the history of psychology, I think the onus is on them to show when and why it works, and to have some mechanistic model. And to my knowledge, we don't have that yet, although Tom is perhaps the closest in the world, so he'll be standing up very, very soon. I realize I got my numbers mixed up. There are 3 approaches. I'm only going to talk about 2, so I forgot to talk about what we call spatializing the curriculum, but I can do it even without slides. A second approach is what Nora Newcomb and others call spatializing the curriculum, where this is driven by the content. So we look at something that teachers are teaching and children are learning, and we say, this might be better taught in a more spatial way. A very good example is measurement. Measurement is a concept. It's not just about laying down the ruler and counting numbers, but it is taking quantifiable units and applying them across space. And Susan Levine and others, just down the road, have invented curricular blocks or units that help to do that. Now there's people who have a grant to spatialize several of the FOSS science learning units. So they go content bit by content bit. They find areas that are, good opportunities. It's a combination of it's really needed and it's a good place to spatialize it, and they do that kind of thing. And that it does work in those domains, but again, we have a problem of, are we going to have to do this for every single unit in every single course? Maybe, and so it definitely works for that particular question. So it's kind of the opposite problem in that it's extremely narrowly done. But with enough, it might work. Okay, now the hybrid that we're proposing is between generalized spatial training and spatializing the curriculum. And this is what we're calling spatial thinking as a set of practices. And it is based on assumptions that are consistent with the next generation science standards. Most people familiar with these? So part of science is doing science. Now, that does not mean that you don't need some content knowledge. So these two are often put in opposition, which is kind of, I think, a sort of silly debate. And the NGS people don't deny the importance of content knowledge, but they do say that an adequate science education must include something about how scientists do science. And you really do need both. And then you need a third thing, which they call cross-cutting themes that put these things together. So a practice is like measurement, representation, graphing. These are things that we do consistently. And what Tom and I are starting to argue is that it is the practices that are the basis of transfer. It's the act of doing things upon space that has the potential to transfer. And I can say that for two reasons. One is just the basic psychology of transfer. You need some sort of reminder. One of the reasons people fail to transfer is they don't put the two contexts together. If you say, I measure in this context, even if one is about the volume of gases and the other is about the length of a road, but if you're a child as a measurer and you understand now I can quantify space and material, those might provide some basis for transfer, not because of just the pure content floating around in your brain, but because of what you do. And eventually this becomes a habit of mind. This is the foundation of Tom's program, ELSA, which stands for Early Learning STEM Australia. And he has been developing an entire program for young children that's based on this idea of developing spatial practices. Some of it's on apps, some of it's in the real world. I'll let him talk about that a little bit, but we'll give you some more examples of what we mean by practices. And now you should arrive. Actually, do you understand my slides?
I've never seen them.
He's not seen the slides. Transfer. You can skip ahead to your slides if you want.
No, that's okay. I'd like to use your slides. They look better than mine.
You can't. You have to hit the
Yeah. So one of the things to start with here is that if you take that what we're calling the third model, which is the Nor and Newcomb model, which suggests that if you spatialise the curriculum, there's much more chance that there'll be some affordances that could provide opportunities for transfer. So that's one side of the coin. The other side, as David said, is this notion of the Sorby work and the Mix and Cheng work, and they have shown some transfer, but I don't know how they did it, and I stay awake at night worrying about how they did it, and this is not to sort of disrespect anybody, but they don't know how they've done it either. And the reason, and that's not to say that it's luck, that's not to say that it doesn't happen. It's just that when these studies are undertaken, they get different effects at different times. So a true replication hasn't happened, number one, and number two, when they do get improvements, those improvements aren't the same thing. Now, as a consequence of that, it's hard to go all the way to the Newcomb model because, I mean, in California alone, there's so many school boards that have slightly different curricula. So if you tried to get in and do this at scale, you would be spending the next 10 years trying to spatialise the curriculum. It's an enormous amount of work. It's frightening to think about how much you would have to do that unless you could get entire school boards or entire curriculum designers on board to work with you. You would have to get teams of people who believe in what you say and be very courageous and risk adverse in order to do it. Okay, so there's got to be somewhere in between that can make this connection so that you can get to this at scale, because that's what we're trying to do. If you think about this idea about practices being more important than content, particularly in the early years of school, and when I say early years, I'm sort of saying from grade 8 down, which I think is for you like middle school down. If you take that as all the domain that I'm talking about, your capacity to have breadth and your capacity to have this scaffolded understanding that builds that you can use to interrogate content is probably the way to go. If for no other reason that these underlying practices are really critical, not just for your ability to train the muscle power, but to understand why you're doing the muscle power. In other words, you can go to the gym and you'll get to a point where it doesn't matter how much you train, you won't improve until you get a personal trainer in, or you start looking at videos, or you start getting your technique right. It doesn't matter. So in a gym, technique matters more than how heavy the weights are you lift. Yeah. Practices get at technique, and that's the way in which that can be undertaken and framed out. So what we are playing around with is the Mix and Cheng or the Sorby-like understandings of what spatial reasoning contains, and they, for example, are what we call the components of spatial reasoning, and you know what they are. So spatial orientation, perspective taking, mental rotation, spatial visualization, spatial structuring. All of these types of ill-defined ways of thinking about space and spatial thinking can be contained within these things. Now, if you look at correlations between and among these different types of components, you'll actually get, in some instances, relatively high correlations. 0.4, 0.5, even up to 0.6 on particular tasks. But there is, of course, a whole lot of variance going on that's unexplained, so they must have some different ways or different affordances in order to be able to structure these things properly. Okay? What we do and what we're proposing is that you have to get at these things, but you have to get at these things in a pedagogical way. So the people who are delivering the programs, which is matters, right? Now, typically, if you saw what David put there and how you don't have to have really good spatial reasoning to be a really good teacher. And you might have seen that top one, the education was going in a negative manner, so it actually doesn't predict at all. In fact, if you look at that, the worse your spatial reasoning, the better your spatial reasoning is, the worse teacher you could be, right? If you really looked at it. Now, so from that perspective, you have to have the teachers confident delivering the program. The only way you can get them confident is actually to build this around some sort of pedagogical framework that actually gets at the practices. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Getting kids to look specifically at mental rotation might help a little bit, but getting them to understand how mental rotation can apply to their daily life is probably much more important. And getting them to be embodied in this and enact in it is going to help a lot, and it's going to take them a little bit further forward. Okay. The second thing is, what might these spatial structuring or mental rotation or spatial orientation components, how might they be related to some of the things that Newcomb is talking about how they might already be in the curriculum? Okay? So if you take something like spatial structuring, Doug Clements and Michael Batista have been saying for a long time, these spatial things are really important for geometry. Mm-hmm. So maybe it is this generic transfer that's the magic key, okay? Rather than focusing on the content, or rather than focusing on these components alone. So if you take something like this from this patterning thing, that you start to get at some forms of structuring in that. Okay, so the patterning the patterning takes place, and you start to make some sort of idea about what the patterning is. It becomes quite a spatial tool if you think about that. Now, if I said to you, some child did this, tell me a story about what the child's thinking, you could propose a whole range of scenarios from a spatial perspective about where you might think those patterns are, what they're trying to do, and getting at things like, are they, for example, and you might get down to, are they all A-B patterns? All right? And it could be that you're getting down to that alone, okay? That these patterns, and then there's a couple of variations where they're not down near the end, okay? So this idea that patterning gets at some of these spatial skills might mean that there could be some transfer to things like algebra, or at least pre-algebraic thinking. Okay? Number lines are another good example. This notion of spatial structuring can be really important when children are trying to make sense of what a number line means and how they can use a number line to facilitate their own understanding. Okay? So number lines are often used in schools for things like trying to understand that numbers don't just go forward, they're not just positive, and that you have to understand that numbers also go the other way. Hence negative numbers is a good example of that. But this ability to be able to structure that is really important, because in school, once they take the numerals away, you have to start to get this understanding of this composition or this component, that these little blocks can go together. What a pity that they got rid of these in schools, right? Because I know that from a pedagogical perspective, sometimes things went a little bit wrong. But the premise for what was happening here is very much about spatial structuring, you know, and often you talk to people who haven't even seen these blocks for 25 years, and they can remember what a particular colour, like the crimson rod, what it represented in a whole range of different ways and ideas. Okay, so this sort of concreteness and this way that we're trying to represent things, like in this instance like fractions, can well be associated with this component. Yes, okay, all right. So, okay, so, all right. So we were. You're making me go. Can I go back to this and go to those, get that other part out of my system first, or not? Or not?
Yes. Just don't drink either. Yeah.
Just don't what?
Yeah. Do whatever. Yeah.
No, I wanted to find those other spatial structuring examples.
There's a couple now.
Okay, I'm going to go to this and then take it back. All right. So here's an example of a task that's in the Australian Grade 5 National Test. So have a look at it for a minute. And this is in the numeracy test that all children in Grade 5 get in May every year. It's an item like this. Now you can't really do this algorithmically or analytically, particularly if you're in Grade 5. And I'm not sure how many people here could do it with confidence analytically anyway.
Does it all have to be one piece, or can I cut up little squares separately?
No, in those pieces. Good,
Okay.
good, very good. Very good question, right? So obviously, if you could cut the parts up, you could do it analytically really quickly, right? You could work out the area of the tag, you could work out the area of the entire piece of paper, and then you could really quickly work out that they have to stay there. Right. Now, what ends up happening is your spatial structuring understandings or skills can be really important here to help you. So, because what you're actually doing is you actually have to provide this, what in this problem is called a tag, and you have to provide this as a unit. Okay, so that becomes your unit. And so when we've watched children doing this, often the first thing they'll do is want to put it into a corner. And they'll either do this by drawing it on the paper, or as tests become more online and digital, they'll actually have to do it in their mind's eye. So this task is way harder if it's on a computer screen than if it's in pencil and paper, okay? But when it's on a computer screen, at least in Australia, the children are provided with paper. And often what we see is the children actually replicating the item, which takes time, and drawing it, and then what we at least call encode it, and then they do their own encoding, and they actually draw on the piece of paper to replicate that, because they can't draw it on the screen. So they tend to start in a corner, and what they might do is start to build this notion of this structure. Now, do they draw them all? Some children do, because they're at that concrete a level they need to do that, right? They actually draw every one, and of course, you get about 90 seconds for an item. Okay, it could have taken that long just to draw up to here, right? And so in that sense, that's what can happen. Other children, they tend to do something else, like start in the middle and see that parts of it can tessellate. Now, remembering this tag doesn't fully tessellate with itself, so that's hard too, right? And so as a rock, they start to provide this into this centre, and then they try and work that around. Okay, others will play around with it from a corner, but then go into thinking, I'm using up a lot of space here. I'm not having any wasted space, or only a little bit of wasted space, so I'm on the right track. Okay, and so this idea here might well be so that when we've done our studies, if they're improving on particular tasks, it might not be because that their spatial training purely is improved alone, but some form of being able to understand structure when they've been doing this has actually helped them, in that T word that I'm almost scared to say, transfer across to other things. And so it could well be the practice that's doing that. Okay, this is an example from a grade 3 test. Okay. Is the answer there, is it? Oh, right. I thought, don't tell me I've done that. Okay, so what children who are successful tend to do is they use the representation on the right as a structure. Okay, and typically they do one of two things. They either think about that thing on the bottom, and so what we've done here is only colour what they can see, but then they get a sense of what might be behind that. Okay, so this idea of the structure that they've captured helps them with, in this instance, the baseline. Yeah, and then from there, it's way easier to count the rest. Okay, and way easier not to double count. Other children do it this way, which I think is slightly more sophisticated, and actually get it from a side view and get that whole structure there and capture that, and then it sort of projects forward for them to see. Okay, so what David and I are working at is this idea that this transfer might not be because of muscle power, and it might not be because the curriculum is so spatial that we haven't been seeing it for 200 years. It might well be the fact that these processes actually help with a range of different affordances that can be used to apply to these different situations. Hence the transfer. So that's the scope of where we're trying to get to. Okay, now I'm going to go back, David, and not show your slides, right? So where do you want me to go backward to?
Oh, that's fine.
Okay, you want to take over again?
I think so.
Good.
I'm going to very quickly tell you about one more line of research that is, I see as a form of teaching a set of spatial practices, but in a much more technologically enhanced way, using computer software that is specifically designed to allow people to do a wide range of spatial practices with their data. And this is with Bob Culver, who is Dean at James Madison University. And this is the project that Katie's working on. I'm going to go very quickly through this, but I just wanted to get you to say that the idea could also be applied to older kids and could be more technology-based. So the geospatial semester started as a senior level in high school optional science elective. So these would be typically students who could have taken AP Physics, AP Chemistry, or AP something else and elected not to, and instead chose this, where it emphasizes geospatial technology and the use of these technologies to solve real-world problems. What we've been doing in the last 2 years now is trying to see if this way of thinking about the world can be something that can be applied and integrate CTE, career and technical education, here within the Chicago public schools. So there are many CTE programs. Some of the ones that we've been working on include agriculture, law enforcement, health, and the problems that people are being asked to solve in those things, which involve multiple variables, constraints that may or may not apply at different times, optimizing but not necessarily finding the optimal solution, compromising. Those are the kinds of ways that students of today are going to have to think, be it in a career in technical education or in advanced STEM. And so the use of GIS technologies, geospatial information systems, we think, with proper instruction and support, supports a way of reasoning that makes you more of a spatial thinker. And I don't have time, but I will very quickly show you some examples of things that have come out of this geospatial semester. They have to do a final project. They spend, about 5-6 weeks on this? And it's a real problem. You have to find the data, you have to find the question, then think about what data might be used to ask it, and then think about ways to represent it. This is from a rural high school near Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. And the problem the student is trying to address is the fact that bears can come out of the park and end up in people's backyards. This is neither good for the bear nor for the person. And so they're very motivated to solve this. But the question becomes, where do you put them back to reduce the chances of this happening again? And the solution to that involves multiple variables. It includes access to roads for a truck that's big enough to accommodate the bear. You can't just throw it in the back of your Toyota and head up the hill. You have to have a safe and large enough thing. But that restricts what road you have access to. And that's the kind of compromises that we want kids to have to think about. And there's different families of bears. And so they try to pick the place that is closest to their relatives and also least likely to lead to repeated offense of ending up in the backyard. So students solve these kinds of problems. And what I've been doing with Bob, and Katie's now doing it much better, is to understand, to ask the question, does this change how they approach problems? Are these becoming practices that they can extend to new spatial problems? And we've done this in several ways, and interviewing students as they progress through the talk and comparing them to a group of students who are not taking the class but are taking other advanced science classes, such as AP Physics, where we wouldn't necessarily expect improvement in this kind of form. And it's not just, can you do the GIS? That's important, but we also want to know, does it give you new practices for solving spatial problems? Do you see new problems in spatial ways? And we analyze this in multiple ways. Here are some of the kinds of questions I mean. If you're running a campaign for local political office, how would you go about running this campaign? This could be a spatial question, but it isn't inherently spatial. And some kids, I can show you, say, I would, for example, recruit local businesses to support me. And because people come in and out, there's a lot of people coming out of these businesses, and so if they support me and they tell their customers, maybe they'll support me. That is not based upon mapping. It's based on some assumptions about distributions, but it's not really a spatialized answer. Or you can get something like this after they take the course. The fact that one is male and the other is female is no way, and it tends to fit the stereotypes, it's just the fact that these are the two students I had access to. It means nothing more than that.
Probably first I would use probably something GIS related to find an area that would probably maybe suit me more, like maybe like my platform. Say like I was sport game marriage, for example. So I do like a map and I have like a poll. I can find like data and like who supports it or not, and then plotting it like on a map, I could see who supports it and then maybe campaign there, like do a lot of campaigning there. So make sure to secure those votes or something like that. So make sure like kind of use a map to look at where I probably.
So he definitely sees this within the context of the GIS course. He immediately sees this as a problem that is about space and thinks about ways to get the data and how to represent it, if you're interested in what he's saying. And we're highlighting some of the NGSS cross-cutting themes that he was picking up on. Here is another student not in that, just as an example, a very typical example.
Since it's local, I really want to speak to as many citizens of the town or county as possible. That would be very important because they have a closer relationship with me than they would if I was running for a congressional seat or something like that. So that would be very important. Also getting as many businesses involved as possible, especially local businesses, because that's a lot of what makes up towns or counties, especially where I live. I think we get plenty of small businesses that have been involved in campaigns that I think make a big difference.
Okay, not focusing on the individuals, but you can see that the first student really sees a spatial problem. You can tell both in his words and his gestures. He's making a map with his hands. And she does use gestures, but they're all beat or didactic gestures where she's just pointing out points to illustrate what she's saying. She's not making any spatial representations with her hands. Mm-hmm. So these patterns hold over many different ways of analyzing it. One of the ways we've analyzed this is simply to ask, do they use more spatial words? And this comes from Pennebaker, who started in clinical psychology analyzing narratives of people that were writing logs about their therapy sessions and seeing what do you do with this data. And as he got more and more about it, you could see that some were getting better and some weren't getting better. And one really kind of low-level but highly effective way to do this was to categorize the words. You know, joy, depression, those are different categories. Several words would fit in there. And you could just count the words that occurred relative to the rate of speech. And you would find that if people are improving, they use more happiness words. And if they're not, they don't. And we sort of stole this technique and applied it to students' descriptions of their final projects and of their solutions to these transfer problems. And we think this is evidence that they are becoming more spatial thinkers. They see this as a spatial problem. Not because we trained their mental rotation, but because we gave them a set of tools that is relevant now to new problems. So in that sense, it's like a series of practice. Currently, I'm very excited to read this paper because we may have found some evidence at the neural level that after you take the class, you're more able to quickly and efficiently recruit spatial areas to solve the problems. So these are syllogisms, classically used in cognitive psychology. And there's been two camps, and we actually think both camps are probably right. Do you solve this analytically as a logic problem, or do you try to make a mental visual model? And the answer is you probably do some of both. But we think that the GIS class has pushed them more to quickly be spatial in their approach. And we know that through analysis of some fMRI data, which is showing greater efficiency in recruitment of spatial areas, even for non-spatial syllogisms. So like, if I say the bear is to the left of the pig, that's a spatial edge. But I can also say something like, the bear is cuter than the pig, or the bear is smarter than the pig, or something like that, which is not inherently spatial. And in both cases, they seem to recruit spatial areas more readily. So I'm going to wrap up so that we have all our time for Chicago, for discussion. As I said, this is very much an ongoing project in the Chicago public schools. It's been really fun and interesting to be part of the CTE set of programs. So the question we're asking is, can this class, which basically was sort of a boutique science elective for pretty high-end, although not the highest-end students in Virginia, can it be scaled up, and how would it have to be modified to fit into a radically different environment? Okay, so that we're trying to spread the geospatial semester into new territory. Okay, so I'm going to end there. So there is hope for spatial training, but not because you're building up the mind as muscle, but in the process of training, you're learning to do things spatially, and that has some potential for transfer. Thank you. And thank you.